I'm really happy to be here, also in order to sort of share with you probably the European perspective on harassment, because from everything I'm following now, especially now Michael's talk, I have the feeling that we are sort of lagging behind quite a bit. So I'm really curious to hear your opinions on what I'm sharing with you. What I'm doing today is I want to share with you a report we published with the Young Academy Groningen last year on harassment and the complaints procedure in our own university. And then I want to sort of connect this with other reports we have seen, especially in the Netherlands over the past years, and play to you this idea that we are probably looking at something we should call network corruption. And I'm really curious to hear your take on calling it that, especially for pushing more towards solutions, which are, at least in the European context, so far quite lacking. So in the Netherlands, which probably most of you know as a very liberal and tolerant country, we've had a couple of reports over the past years that sort of shook up the higher education sector. And the Young Academy report that I'm going to present in detail in a couple of minutes was inspired by these preceding reports. What also happened is that these reports led to some policy changes and some initiatives to sort of improve things. And we still have to see whether this is actually going to happen, but it's en route now. So the two reports I'm referring to are one quantitative, a large survey by the unions based on more than 1,000 surveys showing that bullying, exclusion, sexual intimidation, and power abuse are quite common throughout the 13 universities in the Netherlands. And that was very nicely complemented by a qualitative study by the Dutch Network of Female Professors, which was based on 53 in-depth interviews with only women academics. So this was not a self-selection, but the setup was in a way that especially women were asked to participate. So this doesn't really say anything about men not being targets of bullying. So what the unions report shows is that, so these are percentages that you can see here, the experience of discrimination, exclusion, intimidation, and power abuse, information being held back and being gossiped about is quite pervasive. So this is not incidental, but quite a systemic thing to see. The unions also looked into the reasons for why this would happen. What they find is, it's probably something that most of you are familiar with, is the highly competitive environment of academia, that very high work pressure, the very steep hierarchy, which is probably more of an issue in the Netherlands than in the US. I'm not sure about that. But the hierarchies here are very, very steep. And most people really blame it on bad leadership. So this is the unions report. This is based on a large quantitative sample. Now, if we look into the thematic analysis of the interviews that the Dutch Network of Female Professors have conducted, they sort of came up with 6 manifestations of harassment based on these interviews. The first one is scientific sabotage. I will say a bit more about that in a minute. Sexual harassment, obviously, but also physical and verbal threats. A lot of denigration was reported, so people would feel belittled or would be humiliated in front of others. There's a lot of exclusion being reported, and people also report a lot that special needs are not facilitated. While I have to say that even sort of the terminology of special needs is problematic in and of itself. But so one of the things I want to sort of focus your attention to, especially in relation to corruption, is scientific sabotage. Because also it was the first time that we heard of that in the Netherlands. And they were putting it down to 5 behaviors. First, making a person's work, ideas, or expertise invisible. Second, the refusal of promotion. And then, of course, I understand that Michael says that sometimes you have objective criteria, right? But this one was explicitly the refusal of promotion while a candidate is suitable and the position is available, or the denial of courses, tasks, or functions that are needed for promotion. A third one is blocking a person's access to certain spaces, documents, objects, or pieces of information which they actually need to do their job. Fourth one is labeling people as incompetent vis-a-vis colleagues, but also behind their back. So there you have the gossiping again and smearing reputation. But people also reported on their research projects being actually destroyed physically or financially, which is quite quite significant form of sabotaging someone's career. So the report that we published last year with the Young Academy, so I'm a member of the Young Academy, and we have several working groups in the Young Academy. One of them is called Diversity and Inclusion. And we work together quite closely with the early career researchers community of our university. And we, I think, earned over the years a position of trust, which made people approach us with problems, experiences they made. And what happened after this report that I was just presenting to you was published was that our university management would say, yeah, but this doesn't happen in Groningen. So these two things were our motivation to conduct the research that we finally published. So what we did was we conducted 26 in-depth interviews with current and former employees of our university, University of Groningen. We interviewed 22 female scholars, 4 male scholars. Noticed that 23 of the people we interviewed were international scholars, only 3 were Dutch. And the interesting thing is, so if you see an intersectional aspect here, of course, where all male participants were international scholars and all Dutch participants were female. What's interesting, I think, about our sample is that 9 Rosalind Franklin Fellows were interviewed, and Rosalind Franklin Fellowships are specific fellowships for excellent women to lead them to professorship. So it's actually quite sad that that these are the people that also report being subject to bullying and harassment. We had a number of questions. Most of them were open because we were really interested in what do people actually experience. And I'm not going to go into detail on all of them. Just a couple of them to show you the main results. And I would also like to advise you, I put a couple of quotes up there. I do hope that they are not too triggering, but if you want to maybe skip the next 5 minutes to sort of not expose yourself to stuff that you don't want to see or feel difficult to handle. So what we see, first of all, is that the targets are predominantly young, foreign, and female, and the perpetrators are predominantly senior, national, local, and male. And what we also find is that, and that's, I think, in line with international research, most of the things that get reported are not sexual harassment, but are bullying related, power abuse, discrimination, etc. So some of the things that people would experience is that problems were trivialized, that they would never be treated as an equal, that people would make very racist comments, or that every time they wanted to go up for promotion, the criteria would change. It was like moving targets. And what we also see a lot is nepotism, right? That there seem to be certain people in line that will be promoted no matter how they perform. This is something that that people reported a lot. Over time, the targets of these behaviors would actually recognize that they are not separate cases, because this is very difficult to get your head around. If your university has a zero tolerance policy, and if there's all kinds of policies in place that would protect you from these kinds of things, if they happen to you, it's really difficult to put your finger on it, and also to understand why it's happening to you. But once people understand it, we get these very, very clear statements about who is advantaged and who is disadvantaged in this university. So where people would say foreign women, that's what they consider the worst thing here. Or you could really clearly tell at a glance who was going to be a professor, or also very clearly that people would be at a disadvantage who had any kind of care responsibilities. And that would also apply to men, by the way. And then one of the things, so this is what I find really interesting in the comparison with what I just heard from Michael, for instance, is the reporting. So we do have reporting procedures in place. They are on paper, and on paper everything is really, really well organized. But when we ask our participants what they experienced and whether they actually received support, it's like an odyssey, and everyone was reporting this. So people would start to look for support informally. They would, for instance, talk to colleagues or to HR or to their line manager, although I have to say in many cases in our study, the line managers were also the harassers. And they would be sent from one person to the next, or they would be sent to, for instance, a confidential advisor who would listen to them, but who would not have any kinds of powers to help them. And what many people shared with us was that HR was a huge disappointment, because HR would actually side with management. So if people sometimes would be in situations where they would say, I'm not feeling safe to have my, my talk, my review talk with my line manager alone. Could I take HR? Then they would actually find themselves in a situation where two people would be against them, and they would still be lonely in that situation and very vulnerable. So this happened a lot. So that means the system we have on paper is really not worth that much in practice. And everyone who reported in our sample also was confronted with retaliation, really everyone. So people were gaslighted, silenced, they were blamed for what they experienced, they were isolated, their narratives were changed, they were being framed as difficult people, hysterical, really, really bad. And in the very worst cases, they really had their reputation and careers destroyed. So we did have cases of people who left the university, quite a lot actually, but also people who left academia altogether because they were so damaged by this entire process. This, one of the members of the audience just said that as well. So people are forced, because the complaints management procedure is so poor, they are forced to tell their story over and over and over again, and nobody's helping them, which is sort of experienced as a form of institutional gaslighting, actually. And it basically increases the toll the initial harassment takes on reporters quite substantially, we find. And what we also find is that because there is hardly ever any action taken against harassers, and all the effort is, all the work, the emotional labor, everything is on the targets of the harassment, people witness that and they see that nothing is happening, and that creates a kind of a fear culture in the institution. So this was all very sad to see, and we were actually quite happy that our university leadership was willing to publish the report together with us. But it was published like half a year ago, and we haven't really seen any kind of, tangible change since then. So what we basically see, and this is also how I made the corruption link initially, is there is a specific population in the university that will experience harassment disproportionately. And there's also a specific population that will be the harasser. And the reporting experiences sort of lead you into a local network of people that belong to the same population as the harassers, that will then obstruct the reporting process, and that will also engage in retaliation, and that will basically keep this system that sort of enables the harassment in place. So there is no change because the system is steadily stabilizing itself. So what we find is that all the reports, so not only that one that I just showed you, but also the other reports, and also the one that, for instance, Sherry and Morteza showed, is that oftentimes it's a specific population that is being kept from progressing towards higher or tenured positions in academia by members of local networks, right? And this kind of being kept from can happen actively and also passively, right? If you don't intervene with harassment, you might not be an harasser yourself, but you are certainly enabling the problem. And if you look into the corruption literature, you see that corruption is presented as distorting equal opportunities, excluding persons from fair and honest chances in competing in politics, the economy, or other areas, as we see now, academia, for instance. So I think there is quite some overlap. And what I was especially intrigued by, seeing the kind of network structure that is obstructing and undermining a fair reporting process in the university, is a concept called network corruption, because it explains why in networks the actual mandate of the organization is sort of replaced by subgroup norms and values that then become guiding for behavior. So in informal collective cooperation, in which professional roles are misused for network interests to such an extent that the dominant norm is that of generalized reciprocity. So we have to protect our own people at all costs, and the outsider is to be blamed. So that's basically the dynamic you will see. So what you see also is network corruption involves the right to equal treatment being harmed. And I think we, as at least in Europe, we need some kind of legal way into dealing with these kinds of situations, because like in the US, we don't have real laws against bullying. I know that France has now started to make legislation against bullying, because they had like a really bad wave of suicides after bullying. But I'm not aware that the Netherlands have anything in that order. So what I found interesting in the network corruption sort of metaphor is that it also explains not only why the outsiders are sort of kept from a fair chance to participate in academia, but it also explains the retaliation. and it's explained in that a reporter of these alternative norms would be seen as a threat to the group's subculture, and they would probably try to turn that person. So, which is what we always, what we have often seen in attempts to reframe what people have experienced, so that they would say, well, that person is just a bit, that's just their personality, or maybe you have to get used to the Dutch sense of humor, that kind of stuff. And when that is unsuccessful, then punishment is shown to escalate into exclusionary punishment, which is exactly what we see, that people are physically actually removed from their working environment because they reported harassment. And Morteza and I, we just had this sort of quite short letter to the editor in Nature, where we were actually putting forth this thought that some people sort of bully their way up into professorship. And to be honest, I have never seen anything like the reaction we received to this article. So it went through the roof. I dare say it went viral, and we received a lot of emails from people from all over the world saying, we see exactly this happening. So where you see that people are increasingly aware also that the system is so rigged that they really don't stand any kind of fair chance. So what we see basically in when anti-harassment policies are concerned is that leading scholars in the field are now saying that there has not been any progress over 3 decades. And there's a lot of thinking done, a lot of considerations why that is. And I do believe that it has to do partly with the fact that we never look into power dynamics and into these kinds of more integrity related questions about bullying. And also with gender equality policy. So I mentioned to you the Rosa Franklin fellows in our sample. There was an article just published today by Times Higher Education. They had their gender equality ranking, and they are saying that most universities actually fail to show proof of gender equality policies being put into practice. So what we see is we have a lot of stuff on paper, a lot of good policies, a lot of good initiatives, but the implementation really needs to sort of be stepped up. So I'm really happy also to learn from the US examples what can be done. And in terms of recommendations, because this is why we're here, and I will also wrap it up with that, I think we need to look much more into power dynamics and corruption. And we sort of have to, I think, stop believing in unconscious bias trainings as the one big remedy. And that's what Europe is still all about, unconscious bias, because beware that anyone would say that people really don't want to share that power, right? So I think instead we need to raise awareness about these processes and dynamics among everyone involved in the process. I would really like to see that external bodies are tasked with monitoring and enforcement. This is not the case in the Netherlands so far. Everything stays within one university, even ombudspersons and confidential advisors. I think we also, of course, we need to increase the diversity of higher management and HR in order to, let people not be stuck in their own respective bubbles so much. In terms of hierarchy, it would help a lot if we could erase the dependency of staff on just one manager. So here it's really the case that one person can make or break your career, which makes reporting, of course, incredibly stressful. And it would also be good to strengthen the mandate of, members of the dominant group. So people who belong to the local group to act as allies and also have conversations about what is normal. Yeah, and with that, I would like to give the floor back to you. Thanks a lot for listening to me.